Hey, all you cool cats and kittens, it's your favorite history teacher back at you again with another historical video. And today is my first lecture as a married man. Anyways, we're starting a new chapter, chapter 5, the progressive era, I believe, progressive movement. And we're just gonna zoom on in. Today is a 2 title note day. So remember this the chapter, the progressive movement. Put it up at the upper part of your margin. Chapter 5, the progressive movement. And then today we're going to talk about it's very long. I'm sorry, but we're finally getting into history stuff that was a little over 100 years ago. So we kind of have to talk about those things. So the roots of progressivism. All right. The root word of progressivism, progress. We're talking about moving forward of the country. All right, that was your warm up. Objectives. We're going to understand the goals of progressivism, describe the changes made in local, state, and federal government, outline the events that brought on the women's suffrage movement, and identify the reasons progressives supported prohibition. We are progressives. Bump it up, bump up, bump up. Yeah, I had to count those out. Anyways, progressivism was a collection of different ideas and activities, not a tightly organized political movement with a specific set of goals. Rather, it was a series of responses to problems that emerged from the growth of industry. And progressives had many different ideas about how to fix the problems they saw in American society. All right, who are progressives? So progressivism was a reaction to laissez-faire economics and its emphasis on the unregulated market. So progressives believe that industrialization and urbanization caused many social problems. So they began to address their doubt. Why'd that sound weird? They began to address their doubt the free market's ability to address the problems of poverty of the working class and the filth and crime of urban society. So progressives belong to both major political parties. Most were urban, educated, middle-class Americans. Many leaders worked as journalists, social workers, educators, politicians, and members of the clergy. Most progressives believed the government needed to take a more active role in solving society's problems. They also believed that before the government could fix the problems of society, the government itself had to be fixed. And we all know that from political machines and party bosses, a little corrupt. All right, so cleaning up the muck. Among the first people to articulate progressive ideas was a group of crusading journalists who investigated social conditions and political corruption. That's a test question. They are called muckrakers. And President Theodore Roosevelt nicknamed these writers muckrakers because of what he perceived as their obsession with scandal and corruption. Muckrakers, fake news, different name, different era. Widely circulated cheap newspapers and magazines will help spread the muckrakers' ideas, and muckrakers will uncover corruption in many areas. Some, such as Ida Tarbell and Charles Edward Russell, concentrated on exposing the unfair practices of large corporations. Others targeted government and social problems like Lincoln Steffens, reported on vote stealing and other corrupt political practices of political machines. Still others concentrated on social problems. In his influential book, How the Other Half Lives, Jacob Riis published photographs and descriptions of poverty, disease, and crime that afflicted many immigrant neighborhoods in New York City. And by raising awareness of these problems, the muckrakers stimulated calls for reform. So here you have Teddy Roosevelt on the left, Ida Tarbell. This is Jacob Riis. These are the other two people that elude my memory. Can I speak? And this is a political cartoon of Teddy Roosevelt. cleaning up the muck. He's raking. It says the rake of investigation, meat scandal. And it says a nauseating job, but it must be done. President Roosevelt takes hold of the investigating muckrake himself in the packing house scandal. All right, so here are some photos that Jacob Rees took. I think we kind of talked about realism in the last lecture or the lecture before, and this is how people lived, hanging out. You got kids barefoot looks like it's very cold. And here you have tenements and other houses. Wow, talk about fire safety, fire codes. Fix the government? Question mark. So, hello, goodbye. Progressivism included a range of reform activities united under a general belief that there was a higher public interest than existed above private problems. Different issues led to different approaches, and some progressives took opposing positions on how to address some problems. They condemned government corruption, but did not always agree on the best way to fix the problem. One group of progressives drew its ideas from increasing government efficiency from business. Theories of business efficiency became popular in the 1890s. Frederick Taylor's The Principles of Scientific Management described how a company could increase efficiency by managing time, breaking tasks down into small parts, and using standardized tools, a scientific approach to business that some progressives wanted to extend to the government. Progressives saw corruption and inefficiency in city governments. Many municipal leaders traditionally chose political supporters and friends to run city departments, even though these people knew very little about managing city services. So you have two plans that come forth. You have the commission plan, which would divide city government into several departments with each under an expert of commissioner's control. And then you also have a council manager system, which the city council employed a city manager who was hired. Oh yeah, I just said that. Who was hired by the city council. In both systems, experts played a major role in managing the city. Political machines would be weakened by these democratically elected officials. So that's Frederick Taylor. Democratic reforms, another group of progressives that focused on making government more democratic and responsive to citizens. Many of these people believe that the key to improving government was to make elected officials more responsive and accountable to voters. So Wisconsin became a laboratory of democracy under the leadership of its governor, Robert M. La Follette, who attacked the political parties, how they ran their conventions. Party bosses controlled the selection of convention delegates and nomination of candidates. So La Follette pressured the state legislature to pass a law requiring parties to hold a direct primary, meaning all party members could vote for a candidate to run in the general election. Other instances of reforming the government come about, and you have the initiative, where the initiative permits citizens to introduce legislation and requires the legislature to vote on it. Typically, citizens have to gather a certain number of signatures on a petition to make the initiative legally binding. In an indirect initiative, the proposed law goes into the legislature first. If the legislature refuses to act on it, then it goes on the ballot for the public to vote on it. A direct initiative goes directly to the public for a vote. So, like those props, Prop 27, that's Robert La Follette. More reform. So a referendum will allow citizens to vote on proposed laws directly. In some states, if the legislature passes certain laws, such as a change to taxes, this new law has to be approved by the public in a referendum. Referendums are also used to repeal existing laws. Both referendum and initiative will give reformers the power to bypass or overrule the legislature if it refuses to support something that people wanted. The idea of the initiative referendum was more popular in the West and Midwest. Recall, you kind of know about recall. Recall has provided voters an option to demand a special election to remove an elected official from office before their term expired. Recalls are frequent for their local officials. Progressives will also target the U.S. Senate. The U.S. Constitution originally directed each state legislature to elect 2 senators. Political machines and business interests often influenced those electors. So reformers called for the direct election of senators by voters. A direct election amendment was ratified in 1913 as the 17th Amendment. Although this amendment would end corruption, was an end to end corruption, and also remove one of the state legislature's checks on federal power. To give some, to get out some. So initiative, recall, and referendum are test questions. So you guys might have seen this around. Recall Gavin Newsom a couple years ago. Was it last year? I think it was a few years ago. And another such recall that stems from my past is when Arnold Schwarzenegger became governor of California. Yes, he was an elected government official, Arnold Schwarzenegger. When Governor Gray Davis was recalled, was that 2003? So interesting stuff. All right, women's suffrage. Hey, women, we get to talk about you more. Oh, this fly in my room. So yeah, sorry. This is a lot, and it's very important. So the first women's rights convention occurred in Seneca Falls, New York, 1848, under Elizabeth Cady Stanton, convincing delegates that women's suffrage should be a priority. However, decades later, as we know, abolition got the nod above women. Decades later, the right still had not been gained. Suffragists would be called unfeminine and immoral, and they were threatening. Many of the movement's supporters were abolitionists as well, and in the time before the Civil War, ending slavery, again, took a priority over women's voting rights. After the Civil War, Congress introduced the 14th and 15th Amendments to grant citizenship to African Americans and voting rights to African American men. Leaders of the women's suffrage movement wanted these amendments to give women the right to vote as well. Sadly, they would be disappointed when the politicians refused to include women. So the debate over these amendments will split the suffrage movement into 2 groups. You have the National Women's Suffrage Association, founded by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony in New York City. And they wanted their goal was to have a constitutional amendment passed first. Then you have the other group, the American Women's Suffrage Association, led by Lucy Stone and Julia Ward Howe in Boston. They believed the best way was convincing state governments to grant women the right to vote first. So let it occur in the states, and if it proves to be successful, then pass it nationally. The split, however, would weaken the movement, and by 1900, only 4 states, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and Idaho, gave women these rights. So you have Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and the National Women's Suffrage Association. And here you have the other 2. Who are they? Lucy Stone and Julia Ward Howe. Lucy Stone, Julia Ward Howe, American Women's Suffrage Association. All right, women making moves. In 1890, the 2 groups will unite to form the National American Women's Suffrage Association, NAWSA. The movement still faced the challenge of convincing women to be more politically active. As the progressive movement gained momentum, many women realized that they needed the vote to promote reforms and pass labor laws. Many of the leaders began lobbying state and federal legislatures. What does lobbying mean? Lobbying is when you contact a political leader directly, explain your concern, and try to convince them to vote on legislation that supports your causes. To gain, often lobbyists promise to support the legislator financially when they run for re-election in return for their support. To gain influence, suffrage leaders raised funds for legislatures who supported suffrage and campaigned for their election, even though they could not actually vote for them. So you have the Quaker worker, social worker, and former NASA member Alice Paul will found the National Women's Party, NWP. And the NWP emphasized nonviolent protests to promote women's rights to participate in the democratic process. Its members will picket, block sidewalks, chain themselves to lampposts, and go on hunger strikes if arrested. So here you have the National American Women's Suffrage Association. We demand an amendment to the United States Constitution enfranchising women. Mr. President, what will you do for your women's suffrage? This is the National Ballot Box. This is Alice Paul. Kaiser Wilson. Now, remember, this is around the time of World War I. So Kaiser Wilhelm. Kaiser Wilson, have you forgotten your sympathy with the poor Germans because they were not self-governed? 20 million American women are not self-governed. Take the beam out of your own eye. Don't know what that means, but okay. All right, 19th Amendment. So hunger strikers, those women who would go on hunger strikes if arrested, would be force-fed in prison. And as their story gathered a lot of attention in the press, it would become a national scandal. Equally disturbing would be a police attack on a group of women protesters that left several women with concussions and broken ribs. As the U.S. entered World War I a few months before, President Wilson was trying to portray the U.S. as fighting for freedom and democracy. As a result, the National Women's Party's protest that may have helped convince Wilson to publicly ask Congress to pass an amendment giving women the right to vote. Wilson may have also been influenced by the public support that NASA had given him. So while the NWP focused on a nonviolent protest, leader of NASA at the time, Carrie Chapman Catt, organized a suffrage movement for one final nationwide push for suffrage. And this probably is the one that, the straw that broke the camel's back. She used the organization's funds to support politicians who backed suffrage. She convinced the organization to support President Wilson's re-election in 1960 and then supported the president when he took the country into war in 1917. As more states granted women the right to vote, Congress began to favor for a constitutional amendment. In 1918, the House passed it, but it failed to pass the Senate by 2 votes. So Carrie Chapman Catt used NASA's funds to defeat 2 anti-suffrage senators. And in 1919, the Senate was able to pass it with more than 2/3 majority. And by 1923, 4 of the states had ratified it, and the 19th Amendment went into effect. So women's suffrage is granted with the 19th Amendment. Probably going to need to know that. 19th Amendment, women get the right to vote. Votes for women. And there you have Carrie Chapman Catt. CCC. All right, social welfare. While many progressives focused on reforming the political system, others focused on social problems such as crime, illiteracy, alcohol abuse, child labor, and the health and safety of Americans. The social welfare progressives, as they were called, created charities to help the poor and disadvantaged. Women were prominent leaders of the social welfare progressives. Most came from middle or upper class and felt a responsibility towards the working class women. The main issues that these women faced were poverty, safety, and abuse. Due to the culture at the time, fathers and husbands were expected to work and provide for their families, when women and children who lost their husbands and fathers were exceptionally vulnerable to be forced into poverty. Society also believed women were more physically vulnerable than men. For progressives, the idea that poor women and their children might be forced into difficult and dangerous working conditions would be a very important woman's issue. So, child labor, it's bad. So possibly the most emotional progressive issue was the campaign against child labor. Children had always worked on family farms, but mines and factories presented more dangerous and unhealthy working conditions. Muckraker John Spargo's 1906 book, The Bitter Cry of the Children, presented detailed evidence of child labor conditions. It told of coal mines that hired thousands of 9 or 10-year-old breaker boys to pick out the slag from coal, paying them 60 cents for a 10-hour workday. He will also describe how their work bent their backs permanently and often crippled their hands. Reports of the horrible working conditions grew, and it will convince states to pass laws that set a minimum age for employment and establish other limits on child labor, such as the maximum hours children could work. At the same time, many states began passing compulsory education laws requiring young children to be in school instead of work. That's why you guys are here. So here's some child coal miners. Imagine, when people say sit up straight, imagine this is like you guys sitting at your desk looking at your phone. Bad posture. It might happen. All right, so court cases for progressivism. So factories and railroads had particularly dangerous working conditions. We kind of already know that. When workers were injured or killed on the job, they and their families received little to no compensation. Progressives joined union leaders to pressure states for workers' compensation laws. These laws established insurance funds that employers finance. Workers injured in accidents would receive payments from these funds. So you have two court cases, Lochner versus New York, that should be 1905, and Muller versus Oregon, addressed the government's authority to regulate business to protect workers. In the Lochner case, the court ruled that a New York law forbid bakers to work more than 12 or 10 hours a day was unconstitutional, saying that the state did not have the right to interfere with the liberty of employer and employees. Interesting, right? And in Muller, which involved women working in laundries, the court upheld the state's right to limit hours. So each individual state would be treated as separate in their hopes to limiting the amount of working hours in a day. However, in New York, it was unconstitutional, but in Oregon, it worked. Interesting. These different judgments were based on gender differences. In Lochner, the court adhered to a strict construction of the Constitution, reading it literal, interpreting it literal. That's strict construction. And decided that the government did not have the power to interfere with the right of an employer and employee to make a contract. In Muller, the court had been more activist. The court stated that healthy mothers were the state's concern, and therefore the limits on women's working hours did not violate their 14th Amendment rights, and interpreted that Congress to give the government the power to regulate in the workplace because it perceived public need to keep women safe and treating them differently from men. Health and safety. So we have a big fire, a big tragedy. March 25th, 1911, a tragedy occurred in New York City that led to new reforms. The fire took place on the top floors of the Triangle Shirtwaist Company, which will cause nearly 150 of the 500 workers to lose their lives. Most of these factory employees and fatalities were of young women. So the fire started on the, how do we say it? I believe the Shirtwaist Company was on the 5th and 6th floor, 6th or 7th floor, and the fire occurred on like the 9th or 10th floor. And to improve efficiency for these women or for all workers, there were I think the elevators were broken. So you had to take the stairs. Well, bosses often locked their workers in, so you couldn't leave. And when the fire happens, these people are locked in these buildings. And so the only way they could go out, if they could get out, break through the door, obviously the stairs, but also they'd have to jump out windows. So fearing for their lives, what do? So this disaster illustrated that fire precautions and inspections were inadequate. In response, New York created the Factory Investigating Commission and soon passed laws that reformed labor codes. Some progressives also favored zoning laws as a method of protecting the public. These laws divided a town or city into zones for commercial, residential, and other developments, thereby regulating how land and buildings could be used. Building codes set minimum standards for light, air, room size, and sanitation, and required buildings to have fire escapes. Health codes required restaurants and other facilities to maintain clean environments for their patrons. Of course, I don't want to eat dirt when I go to a restaurant. So here's the shirtwaist factory. Here's the fire. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah. And then sadly, these are the pictures of the young ladies in their coffins. I plead the fifth. So zoning laws created a constitutional question. The Fifth Amendment states that no one shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. So if the government takes something of value from someone, it is supposed to pay for it. As governments began to impose zoning laws on communities and improve sanitation, safety, and quality of life, and individuals and businesses began to complain that they were losing the use of their property. They argue that the government should compensate them for their losses. And so there are two such cases. In Hadachek versus Sebastian, a brickmaker argued that he needed clay on his land to make bricks, and that zoning laws forced him to move his kiln, the thing he makes the clay in, deprived him of his Fifth Amendment rights. So the court disagreed, finding that zoning laws were a constitutional use of the government's police power to protect public health. And in 1922, a Pennsylvania Coal Company versus Mahone, the court narrowed its interpretation. The coal company owned the rights to mine under a piece of land, but a law prohibited mining land that supported buildings on the surface. The court agreed that the law had gone too far. Under the Fifth Amendment rights, the coal company had been denied its property and was owed compensation. So the case established that the government does not have an unlimited right to regulate property use. Only when the public, the safety of the public or the interest of the public is at question. So if you know who Dave Chappelle is, this is a famous scene where the Fifth Amendment gets talked about. I plead the fifth. All right, blame it on the alcohol. Many progressives blamed alcohol for many of society's problems. Society at the time tended to view drinking as acceptable for men, but not for women, and men consumed the vast majority of the alcohol produced. As a result, social welfare progressives again focused on the problems that alcohol abuse created for women. Settlement house workers knew that the wages were often spent on alcohol and not the family. Drunkenness would lead to physical abuse, illness, poverty, and abandonment. Also, poor working conditions. When you're working on just being efficient and you go to work hungover, you're not as efficient. From these concerns emerged one of the major women's issues of the era, the temperance movement. Back in the day, remember temperance, which advocated for people to stop or moderate their alcohol consumption. Women would be the important leaders of the temperance movement. You have the Women's Christian Temperancing, WCTU, formed in 1874. Under the leadership of Frances Willard, temperance grew to a national movement with a significant influence. Willard will convince the WCTU to support women's suffrage, champion many social welfare causes, including prison reform, equal pay for women, protections for children, and the 8-hour workday. So that's Frances Willard. Lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours. Prohibition. Test question. In 1893, evangelical Protestant ministers created the new group, an anti-saloon league. When the temperance movement began, it concentrated on reducing alcohol consumption. Later, pressed for prohibition, laws banning the manufacture, transportation, and sale of alcoholic beverages. Despite significant opposition by working class voters, support for prohibition will grow steadily. By 1916, 19 states had introduced some form of prohibition on alcohol, and leaders of the prohibition movement began to push for a constitutional amendment banning the manufacture, transportation, or sale of alcohol in all of the United States. And in 1919, it would be ratified. In 1920, it would go into effect January 1st, 1920, as the 18th Amendment. So yeah, we have the 17th Amendment, direct elections of senators, the 18th Amendment, alcohol being prohibited, and the 19th Amendment, women's rights. Big times, big times. Liquor ban in force, and here you have people getting caught with their liquor being poured down the drain, literally. P. Sherman, 42 Wallaby Way, Sydney. Name that movie. Some of the most visible and longest lasting efforts to regulate business during the Progressive era were on the national level. Congress will pass a number of proposals to regulate the economy under Presidents Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. Many agreed that business needed regulation, so some believed that government should break up big companies and restore competition. This will lead to the passage of the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890. Now, don't let that fool you, because the Sherman Antitrust Act was actually used not to break up trusts, but actually used to break up unions, sadly. So, more on that later. Others will argue that big business was the most efficient way to organize the economy. They pushed for governments to regulate big companies and prevent them from abusing their power. So the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC, created in 1877 to regulate railroads, would be an example of this kind of thinking. So here you have some political cartoons of trusts. Big fat. The trusts are big fat and they're spilling, and it says putting the screws on them, putting them under control. Socialism in America. Some activists went so far as to advocate for socialism, the idea that the government should own and operate industry for the community. They wanted the government to buy up large companies, especially industries that affected everyone, such as railroads and utilities. At its peak, socialism had national support. You wouldn't believe it, but it did. Eugene V. Debs, the former leader of the American Railway Union, won nearly 1 million votes as the American Socialist Party candidate for president in 1912. Yes, we had a socialism party here in America. However, most progressives and most Americans believe in the superiority of the American system of private ownership, not community ownership. Sorry, guy. All right. That concludes this lecture. Let me get the book. Whoops. Hold on. Hold on. So your homework, sorry, never have the book in front of me. Your homework will be page 218, questions 2 through 4. Wait, no, 2 through 5, my bad. So questions 2, 3, 4, and 5, page 218, that's your homework. So yeah, if you guys did enjoy that, make sure you hit that like button, leave a comment, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.